And as KTVA's Liz Raines and Nat Hertz from the Alaska Dispatch knows, they're here to tell us that election year politics is probably already underway. Governor Bill Walker still won't say if he'll push for an income tax in a special session that he hopes to call at the end of next month.
Every time I use the word, the T word, certain people cringe. But
At a Resource Development Council meeting on Thursday, the governor was pressed for more details about how he would close the state's multi-billion-dollar budget gaps, which are expected to continue into the future. But Walker avoided naming a specific tax.
Some talk about a seasonal sales tax, some talk about an income tax, some talking about different head tax, a school tax. There's different ways of doing it, and the one that the best one is the one that will pass the legislature.
Walker says before he calls a special session, he'll consult lawmakers about what kind of revenue measures they'd be most likely to support. Right now, an income tax faces stiff opposition from Senate Republicans.
When you take money from the private sector in the form of an income tax, there is less money for people to expand their businesses, to invest in assets, to pay for college. Those are the things that make the economy grow and expand and produce more jobs over the long term.
Both the House and the Senate favor some use of permanent fund earnings, but don't agree on just how to do that. And in the middle of all of this, we have next year's elections. To pass new taxes or tap the earnings of the permanent fund could make for some strong political headwinds. And Liz Raines and Nat Hertz join us. Liz covers politics for KTVA and Nat for Alaska Dispatch. I can imagine that neither of you are terribly thrilled about the prospect of a fourth special session, but is the fourth time a charm, maybe?
It's hard to imagine a different scenario than the last 6 months that we lived down in Juneau, but we hear from both sides that they're interested in solving the state's budget problems in a long-term capacity. They have their differences about how they would go about doing that, but it's hard to say if the fourth time is going to be a charm. The governor mentioned he's going to try to get some consensus before calling a session and sending everybody back down there for another round of session. So I guess we'll just have to see, but I think that there is a will on both sides to come up with some sort of a long-term plan.
It sort of feels like Groundhog Day every time they have a special session. Do you feel that they have gotten anything done, kind of evolved to a point where they can do something?
I am just thinking back. I started covering the legislature in 2015, and I think there were 2 or 3 special sessions that year, plus a fourth, and then last year there were 2 or 3 or 4, and we went into July, and this year there have been 3, and it's like the debate is still the same, and I think some people have kind of moved on and moved forward in their ideologies. It was interesting to see that the voters apparently picked a group of people to lead the House that actually are proposing all kinds of different fiscal fixes. The Senate, I think things have changed. The Senate is, their plan was, didn't include a tax this year, but it did include, use of the permanent fund earnings. And it's like both chambers, even though you have different parties leading them, seem to recognize that something has to be done. It's just a question of, what exactly does that look like? And, I don't see that the sort of dam has broken of that disagreement between, earlier this year and now. We haven't gotten any indication of that yet.
So let's look at where we are now. Now, we have some numbers from the Department of Revenue to look at here. And this looks at how fast we're spending down our main savings account, the Constitutional Budget Reserve. So in the course of the past 3 years, we've spent $9 billion of our savings. And as for next year, as we head into fiscal 19, we have some numbers there that show you where we stand with that. It looks like we will be in the hole at the end of that. We will have about $1.2 billion of red ink if we have the same kind of deficit that we had this year. And then, if you look at our other savings accounts, we have also spent out a statutory budget reserve, a public education fund. So I guess that's where we are now. And we have this chicken and the egg question all the time. Do we have a sales tax? Do we have a income tax? Do these things hurt the economy? Do they help the economy?
And I think that's where it's really going to be interesting to see what the governor puts on the call for this upcoming session. The governor has said that they don't necessarily need to have a tax that's going to fill the budget gap, but something symbolic in place that could perhaps be adjusted in the future. And so there's different schools of thought on that of, do you go ahead and put a structure in place knowing that it won't do much for the budget this upcoming year, perhaps not until several years down the road, but to go ahead and put something in place now as we see our savings dwindle. And then on the other side, you've got those who say, well, you put that structure in place and then you risk just increasing it, instrumentally to where it's not what was originally intended.
I was just going to challenge you, Rhonda. I would be impressed if you could find an expert who would come on your show and say that any of the measures being contemplated to fix the budget gap will help the economy. I think you're talking about a tax, you're talking about taking money away from people in the form of the permanent fund. I think it all hurts the economy. So it's really a question of how, who you want to hold harmless, who you feel like is able to, sustain paying more money to the government or having less money paid to them. And there are different impacts on different sets of people, depending on which proposal you're relying most heavily on. The permanent fund, if you're taking money out of the dividend, that affects low-income people the most. An income tax, if you're proposing it as the House majority did, that's going to hit higher-income people much proportionally. Maybe I don't know if it's a lot harder than lower-income people, but certainly they're going to be giving up many more dollars on an absolute sense. So it's I think that's. The question is not, can you avoid harming the economy with one of these ideas or a combination of these ideas? It's sort of, how do you want to do that?
Well, the governor did say, if you want to save the income tax, if you want to save the permanent fund dividend, then you've got to reduce it. The income tax will build confidence that the state has its act together. Those have been some of the counter arguments, but I think you're right. We need more discussion about something that's so important to us. But I did get the sense when the governor spoke to the Resource Development Council this week that he's not as optimistic as he used to be.
Well, we did hear him for the first time use words like doubtful when he talked about continuing with the state's gas project for a gas pipeline. He says a lot of that has to do with the market, and it's the market that's going to determine whether or not somebody is willing to invest and help us pay for something like that. So certainly it's one of the most expensive projects of its kind in North America. And with the state's budget situation that it's in right now, hearing him use that word doubtful about continuing on with the project seemed to be very reflective of the state situation financially.
The direness of it. And he put it this way when he was asked about putting more money into the Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation, that at this point, there's a fire in the house and you don't add a pool if you've got a fire. So it sounds like even he is acknowledging that we're at this make or break point. Do you feel like we are at the edge of the cliff here?
I think that it is useful for the people who want to solve the problem to characterize the problem as dire. I think, in my mind, certainly the state has sort of a cash flow problem and an accounting problem as far as, we're spending a certain amount of money and we have a certain amount of money coming in, and those two don't sort of obviously match. But when you think about it, we do have the $60 billion permanent fund over here that generates, if you assume a 5% return, that's $3 billion a year. So there's a lot of money in the permanent fund, and ultimately, no one is talking about slashing the budget in half. So ultimately, there has to be a source of money to pay for that budget, and it's kind of like it's probably going to come from there, or it's going to come from there and a tax. And it really, there aren't other options. You can't really ignore that once you run out of money. So I don't know that I see it as a crisis, because the fix to the problem seem really obvious, and it's just a question of which one becomes the consensus once you run out of other options.
But is it politically possible? Do you really feel like they're going to act on it if the governor calls a special session?
Next month? You know, like I said, I think it's really hard to imagine a situation that's different than the last 6 months that we saw down in Juneau. Lawmakers wrapped up their last special session in July, so there hasn't been that much time off. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see if there is some combination of these proposals that's been piecemealed together that we didn't see during those discussions.
But politics entering to it, the next election cycle.
Yeah, and that's been the big
Are you
argument
feeling
for
it
doing
already?
that now. Well, you know, we've already seen some legislators come out and say that they're vying for certain positions, statewide positions. So I think we could definitely see that influencing some of the discussion.
How about you, Nat? Do you see the next year elections influencing this year's discussion?
Do the coming elections ever not influence the discussion? I mean, I think there's no question, and I think the elections influence this year's, previous discussions. We've seen just in the past couple of months, we're still more than a year away from the general election next year, but we've got Mike Dunleavy, who's going to be a candidate for governor. He obviously has strong views about the permanent fund and about taxes, and he's clearly going to be a vocal presence in the Senate next year. He's running for governor. We've got Kevin Meyer, who's also in the Senate, who's going to be running for lieutenant governor. And every single person in the House is going to be up for re-election, and they've got to consider, do their constituents, which of these options that you would need to fix the budget problem will their constituents be least angry with them for choosing?
And they've got the last election as an example. Where some constituents rebelled and turned their lawmakers out of office. Liz, we've got time for one more question, and I want to ask you this. Do you feel like Governor Walker has the support within the legislature, the leadership? I mean, Clem Tillion talked about being a hammer for Hammond. Does the governor have any equivalent to that?
Well, at the beginning of this legislative session, it seemed that the House Majority Coalition had been sort of founded around some of the principles that he was advocating for. But throughout the sessions, we saw that even within that coalition, there's different factions, different schools of thought about combining the different levers available to solve this budget problem. And it's not a binding caucus. So I think that makes it really difficult to have sort of that hammer that Tillion was talking about.
So it's a tough scenario all around. I want to thank you both of us, Nat Herz and Liz, for joining us. And we would like to hear from you and get your take on what you think is the right fiscal fix for Alaska. You can send us your comments to frontiers@ktva.com. And we also would like to have some of your photos. We'd love to share the beautiful scenery and wildlife of our state. And in fact, we leave you now with a last look at Halibut Cove, set to the music of Al Koenig, a guitarist from Eagle River. This is from his Sundog album. We'll see you next week.